whispers of forgotten empires, echoes of lost gods, and truths buried in time. Welcome to Ancient Luminaries, where the ancient world comes alive.
Have you ever wondered how one extraordinary woman could stand against the rising power of Rome itself? Armed not with armies or weapons, but with a brilliant mind, fierce ambition, and unmatched political genius. Welcome to this peaceful journey through ancient history. Tonight, we are traveling back more than 2,000 years to discover the real story of Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, whose intelligence and strategic brilliance would make her one of the most powerful rulers the ancient world ever knew. This is not the romanticized tale you may have seen in movies. This is the true story of a young queen who inherited a kingdom at the crossroads of history, when the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart through civil wars and deadly power struggles. In the year 69 before the Common Era, the ancient Mediterranean world stood on the edge of enormous change. The Roman Republic, once a mighty force that had conquered vast territories, now found itself locked in bitter internal conflict. Generals turned against generals, senators plotted against senators, and the entire balance of power in the known world hung in uncertainty. Yet far to the east, one kingdom remained the wealthiest and most prosperous realm in the entire Mediterranean: Egypt. For nearly 3 centuries, Egypt had been ruled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. These rulers were of Greek origin, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, yet they had wisely adopted the ancient traditions and sacred customs of the Egyptian pharaohs to legitimize their reign. Into this world of shifting alliances and constant danger was born Cleopatra VII, daughter of Ptolemy XII. Her name meant glory of the father, but she would soon create a legacy of glory entirely her own. Her childhood unfolded in the most magnificent city of the ancient world, Alexandria. With more than 500,000 people from dozens of cultures, Alexandria served as the dazzling center of learning, trade, and culture. The Great Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, guided ships from every corner of the Mediterranean into its bustling harbors. The legendary Library of Alexandria held hundreds of thousands of scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of human civilization. Greek philosophers debated in marble halls alongside Egyptian priests and scholars from distant lands. This cosmopolitan environment would shape young Cleopatra in profound ways. While most rulers of her dynasty spoke only Greek and relied on interpreters, she became the first pharaoh in her line to master the Egyptian language. She would eventually speak 9 languages fluently. Her education was extraordinary even by royal standards. Guided by the greatest scholars of Alexandria in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and the arts of governance. But the world she was born into was far from peaceful. Egypt's legendary wealth made it a tempting prize for Rome, and the Ptolemaic court was filled with palace intrigue, rival factions, and dangerous ambitions. Cleopatra would grow up watching her father struggle to maintain independence while navigating the overwhelming power of Rome. Born in the magnificent palace complex of Alexandria in the year 69 before the Common Era, Cleopatra VII Philopator entered the world as the daughter of Ptolemy XII. Her full name meant glory of the father, yet from her earliest days, it was clear she would forge a glory entirely her own. The royal palace where she spent her childhood was one of the most splendid places on earth. Marble halls stretched for what seemed like endless distances, decorated with golden statues of Egyptian gods and Greek heroes standing side by side. Courtyards filled with fragrant lotus flowers opened onto terraces that overlooked the great harbor, where ships from every nation arrived daily carrying spices from Arabia, silks from the east, and grain from the fertile Nile Valley. The distant call of the lighthouse's beacon guided those vessels safely home each night, its great fire glowing like a star fallen to earth. Even as a very young princess, Cleopatra stood apart from her siblings. While other children of the court played in the gardens or listened to storytellers, she asked endless questions. She wanted to understand why the Nile flooded each year, how the stars moved across the sky, and why certain alliances between kingdoms succeeded. This natural curiosity would shape everything that followed. Her education began almost as soon as she could speak. The greatest scholars of the Library of Alexandria were brought to the palace to serve as her personal tutors. They taught her 9 languages with remarkable speed. She learned Greek, the language of her Ptolemaic ancestors, but she insisted on mastering Egyptian as well, the ancient tongue of the people she would one day rule. She became the very first pharaoh in her entire dynasty to speak fluent Egyptian without any interpreter. By the time she reached her teenage years, she could converse effortlessly in Hebrew, Arabic, Ethiopian, Latin, and several other dialects. This gift allowed her to speak directly to priests in their temples, to merchants in their marketplaces, and to foreign ambassadors in their own tongues. No longer would Egypt's ruler need to rely on others to translate the words that carried the kingdom's fate. Her academic training was just as extraordinary. In the cool marble halls of the palace library, she studied philosophy under the guidance of the finest minds in the Mediterranean. She debated the ideas of Plato and Aristotle, learning to question the nature of power, justice, and leadership. Mathematics taught her precision and logic. She mastered geometry and astronomy, skills that would later help her understand trade routes, agricultural planning, and even the movement of armies. Rhetoric became one of her sharpest tools. Her tutors trained her to craft arguments so persuasive, so clear, and so compelling that they could sway the most skeptical listener. She practiced delivering speeches before mirrors and before small groups of trusted advisors, perfecting the tone, the timing, and the gestures that would one day command the loyalty of entire nations. But Cleopatra's education went far beyond books and scrolls. She received intensive training in the practical arts of ruling. Military strategy was studied through maps and accounts of famous battles. She learned how supply lines worked, how terrain could decide victory or defeat, and how the loyalty of soldiers could be earned or lost. Economic policy was another focus. She examined the kingdom's tax records, studied the flow of grain and gold, and learned how trade agreements could strengthen or weaken a realm. Diplomacy, perhaps the most delicate art of all, taught her to read people's true intentions, to identify their hidden weaknesses, and to turn potential enemies into valuable allies through carefully chosen words and gestures. Most importantly, she absorbed the hard-won lessons of her own Ptolemaic dynasty. For nearly 3 centuries, her family had survived in a dangerous world dominated by far larger powers. They had learned a vital truth: to play the great empires against one another with exquisite care. Never appear so weak as to invite conquest, yet never appear so strong as to provoke a preemptive attack. Cleopatra studied the successes and failures of her ancestors in detail. She saw how some Ptolemaic rulers had paid heavy tribute to Rome and lost their independence, while others had cleverly balanced alliances and preserved Egypt's wealth and autonomy. These historical examples became her private textbook. She vowed that when her time came, she would never allow Egypt to become merely a client kingdom at the mercy of Roman generals. From the golden halls of the palace to the shaded courtyards overlooking the great harbor, young Cleopatra spent her childhood preparing for greatness. She walked among the marble columns, where philosophers once argued, stood beneath the towering lighthouse that guided ships from distant lands, and listened as Egyptian priests whispered the ancient rituals that had sustained the kingdom for thousands of years. Every experience, every lesson, every conversation was quietly shaping the brilliant strategist who would one day challenge the might of Rome itself. She watched her father, Ptolemy XII, navigate the treacherous relationship with Rome. She saw the heavy cost of depending on foreign protection, and she quietly resolved that Egypt's future would be different. Even as a girl, she began building quiet relationships with military officers, temple priests, and key administrators, learning the subtle art of cultivating loyalty long before she would need it. The years of Cleopatra's childhood passed in the golden glow of the palace, but the kingdom her father ruled was never truly at peace. Ptolemy XII, known to his subjects and to history as Auletes, the flute player, had earned that mocking nickname because of his passionate love for music. He spent hours playing the flute in the royal chambers, while the real business of governing Egypt slipped through his fingers. He was a man of culture and refinement rather than a decisive ruler, and his reluctance to confront the growing power of Rome had already created deep resentment among the proud nobles and priests of Alexandria. By the time Cleopatra was 11 years old, in the year 58 before the Common Era, the tensions that had been simmering for years finally boiled over. Alexandrian nobles, furious at the king's repeated concessions to Roman creditors and his willingness to accept Roman protection in exchange for continued rule, rose up in a popular uprising. They drove Ptolemy XII from the throne and installed his older daughter, Berenice IV, as queen in his place. The royal family was forced to flee the magnificent palace they had called home. For young Cleopatra, the sudden exile was a shocking and traumatic break from the only life she had ever known. Yet even in this moment of crisis, the 11-year-old princess showed the same sharp intelligence and quiet determination that had marked her from birth. When her father decided to seek help in Rome itself, the very heart of the growing empire that threatened Egypt's independence, Cleopatra chose to accompany him. She left behind the familiar marble halls, the great library, and the towering lighthouse, traveling instead across the Mediterranean on a journey filled with uncertainty and danger. For 3 long years, the royal exiles lived in Rome, moving between the homes of sympathetic senators and wealthy patrons who might be persuaded to support their cause. Rome in those years was a city of astonishing contrasts, and young Cleopatra observed everything with wide, unblinking eyes. She saw the gleaming temples and forums where the Senate debated the fate of nations, but she also witnessed the brutal reality of Roman politics. Corruption was everywhere. Senators accepted bribes openly, generals demanded payment for their loyalty, and powerful families plotted against one another with ruthless efficiency. Violence was never far beneath the surface. Assassinations, street riots, and political executions were common tools used by those who sought power. Yet beneath the chaos, Cleopatra noticed something else, something that would shape her understanding of power for the rest of her life. Roman politics, for all its brutality and greed, was extraordinarily effective. The Romans moved with purpose. They understood leverage, they calculated risks with cold precision, and they never forgot a favor or an insult. Their system, however ugly, produced results. She watched her father negotiate desperately for Roman military support to regain his throne. Ptolemy XII promised enormous tribute payments, trading concessions, and future military cooperation in exchange for the legions that would restore him. Cleopatra stood quietly at his side, listening as Roman senators and generals treated these negotiations like profitable investments rather than acts of generosity. They expected increasing returns on their support over time, and they viewed Eastern kingdoms such as Egypt not as proud independent realms, but as sources of wealth to be exploited. She saw how Romans respected strength and were attracted to displays of luxury, yet they also possessed a practical appreciation for competent administration and reliable partnership. These 3 years in Rome became an advanced education that no tutor in Alexandria could ever have provided. Cleopatra studied the individual personalities of the men who controlled Roman policy toward the Eastern Mediterranean. She learned their motivations, their factional disputes, and the subtle ways they balanced personal ambition with public duty. She observed the efficiency with which Roman legions operated, the discipline of their soldiers, and the ruthlessness with which they pursued victory. Most importantly, she came to understand that successful diplomacy with Rome required offering concrete benefits while still projecting confidence and independence. Weakness invited conquest, but blind submission earned only contempt. The experience of exile was painful for the young princess, yet it also provided invaluable lessons about the fragility of political power and the absolute necessity of maintaining popular support. She saw how quickly a ruler could lose everything when the people turned against him. She watched her father humble himself before Roman officials, promising away Egypt's future revenues just to regain his crown. These observations burned themselves into her memory. She vowed that when she ruled, she would never allow Egypt to become so dependent on foreign protection that its own people would rise up in revolt. In the year 55 before the Common Era, the long exile finally ended. Roman military support arrived exactly as Ptolemy XII had bargained for. The legions marched into Alexandria, crushed the resistance, and restored the flute player to his throne. Berenice IV, who had ruled in his absence, was captured and executed, eliminating one dangerous rival to the royal succession. The family returned to the palace, but the victory came at an enormous cost, both financial and political. Egypt was now forced to pay massive tributes to Rome, draining the kingdom's legendary wealth year after year. Roman troops remained stationed permanently in Alexandria, a constant reminder that the ancient kingdom was no longer fully sovereign. The once proud Ptolemaic realm had become, in all but name, a client state of the Roman Republic. The humiliation weighed heavily on everyone at court, but especially on the now 14-year-old Cleopatra. She had seen with her own eyes how Rome operated. She understood that the legions camped outside the palace were not guests but enforcers of Roman will. During her teenage years, Cleopatra learned to operate within this tightly constrained environment. She could not openly oppose Roman influence without risking the dynasty's survival. Yet she also refused to accept permanent subordination. The solution she began to form in her mind was characteristically sophisticated and patient. She would work within the Roman system while quietly building Egypt's internal strength and her own political capabilities. She would demonstrate her value as an ally, making Rome see Egypt as too useful to destroy. At the same time, she would master every skill necessary for true leadership, preparing for the day when changed circumstances might allow greater independence. She continued her studies with even greater intensity now that she had seen Rome firsthand. She analyzed every report that reached the palace about Roman politics, noting which generals were rising, which senators were falling, and how the balance of power in the Republic continued to shift. She cultivated relationships with key military officers who controlled the armies defending Egypt's borders. She strengthened ties with the priests who managed the great temples and legitimized royal authority in the eyes of the Egyptian people. Most crucially, she built connections with the scholars and administrators who actually ran the complex bureaucracy that kept the kingdom functioning. The restoration of her father's throne had come at a price that would echo through the rest of Cleopatra's life. Egypt's debts to Roman creditors grew heavier each year. The annual flooding of the Nile, which had always been the foundation of the kingdom's agriculture, became less predictable, creating food shortages that threatened social stability. Palace intrigue continued as ambitious nobles and royal relatives maneuvered for advantage. Through it all, Cleopatra watched and learned. She saw how even the most ancient and prosperous kingdoms could lose their independence through weakness or poor strategic choices. She observed how Roman politicians viewed Eastern realms primarily as sources of wealth rather than as legitimate political entities deserving respect. These experiences taught her that survival required more than intelligence and diplomatic skill. It demanded the ability to project strength and confidence in negotiations with far more powerful neighbors. She would need to convince the Romans that Egypt was valuable enough as an ally to be worth preserving, while simultaneously making clear that any attempt to annex the kingdom outright would be costly and difficult. The challenge was made even more complex by the internal divisions within Egypt itself. The Ptolemaic court remained a nest of factional disputes, personal rivalries, and competing claims to the throne. Cleopatra learned to navigate these treacherous waters with remarkable skill for someone so young, always listening more than she spoke, always calculating the long-term consequences of every alliance and every decision. By the time her father's health began to fail in the late 50s before the Common Era, Cleopatra had already become a formidable political operator in her own right. She had turned the years of exile and the humiliating restoration into a masterclass in power. She understood Rome better than most Romans understood themselves. She spoke their language, knew their customs, and had studied their strengths and weaknesses at the closest possible range. The young woman who had once stood silently beside her father in the halls of the Roman Senate was now preparing herself to inherit a kingdom that stood on the edge of a knife. Egypt's independence was fragile. Its wealth was being drained, and its future depended entirely on the skill of whoever sat upon the throne next. The lessons of those years would never leave her. She had learned that power was never given freely. It had to be earned, negotiated, and defended every single day. She had seen how quickly fortunes could change when a ruler lost the support of his own people or the favor of Rome. Most of all, she had come to believe that intelligence, patience, and careful preparation could overcome even the greatest disadvantages. As her father's reign drew to its close, Cleopatra stood ready. The girl who had traveled to Rome as an 11-year-old exile had returned as a young woman forged in the fires of political reality. She would soon face challenges that would test every lesson she had learned during her father's troubled reign and her years of exile, but she faced the future with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived the worst that politics could throw at her. The palace in Alexandria once again became her classroom. She reviewed the kingdom's financial records late into the night, studied military maps of the borders, and held private conversations with the most capable administrators and generals. She knew that when the moment came for her to take the throne, she would inherit not only the crown of Egypt but also its crushing debts, its restless nobility, and its dangerous dependence on Rome. Yet she also knew that she possessed something her father had never fully developed: a complete understanding of how power truly worked in the Mediterranean world of the 1st century before the Common Era. That knowledge, combined with her extraordinary education and her unflinching will, would soon transform her from a princess who had survived exile into the last and greatest pharaoh of Egypt. The story of Ptolemy XII's reign and the years of exile had come to an end, But for Cleopatra, they represented only the beginning of her own extraordinary journey. The young woman who had once hidden among the shadows of Roman politics was now preparing to step fully into the light, ready to write the next chapter of Egyptian history with a boldness and brilliance that would echo through the ages. The story of Ptolemy, the 12th's reign, and the years of exile had come to an end. But for Cleopatra, they represented only the beginning of her own extraordinary journey. The young woman who had once hidden among the shadows of Roman politics was now preparing to step fully into the light, ready to write the next chapter of Egyptian history with a boldness and brilliance that would echo through the ages. In the year 51 before the Common Era, when Cleopatra was just 18 years old, her father Ptolemy XII died suddenly. The throne of Egypt passed, according to ancient Ptolemaic tradition, to his eldest surviving child. Cleopatra VII was crowned pharaoh, but she would not rule alone. Custom required her to share the throne with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was only 10 years old at the time. This co-rulership arrangement had been designed to maintain dynastic legitimacy while placing real power in the hands of the more experienced ruler. From the very moment of her coronation, however, Cleopatra faced challenges that would have overwhelmed any less prepared leader. The kingdom she inherited was burdened with enormous debts to Roman creditors. Years of tribute payments and the high cost of her father's restoration had drained the royal treasury almost to the breaking point. The military was weakened by long neglect, its equipment outdated, and its soldiers demoralized. Most dangerously, the annual flooding of the Nile, the very lifeblood of Egyptian agriculture, had become irregular in recent years. Poor floods meant smaller harvests, rising food prices, and growing unrest among the farmers who formed the backbone of the kingdom. Famine loomed as a real possibility, and with it came the threat of social instability that could tear the country apart. Cleopatra understood that she had only a narrow window to prove her competence before her brother's ambitious advisors began to challenge her authority. Rather than attempting to solve every problem at once, she moved with the surgical precision she had learned during her years of study and exile. Her first priority was to seize control of the complex bureaucracy that actually governed Egypt. The Ptolemaic administrative system was one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, with specialized departments handling tax collection, temple maintenance, foreign trade, irrigation, and grain storage. Over the generations, however, many officials had grown loyal to their own interests rather than to the crown. In her first months as pharaoh, Cleopatra conducted a systematic and ruthless review of every department. She summoned the heads of each ministry to the palace, examined financial records with her own eyes, and evaluated the competence and loyalty of every key administrator. Those who demonstrated both skill and faithfulness were promoted to positions of greater responsibility. Those who appeared unreliable, corrupt, or potentially disloyal were quietly transferred to less sensitive roles or removed entirely. The changes were implemented gradually so as not to disrupt essential services, but the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Within a year, the entire governmental apparatus had been placed under direct royal control. For the first time in many generations, the bureaucracy answered to the pharaoh rather than to itself. At the same time, Cleopatra turned her attention to the kingdom's desperate financial situation. She opened careful negotiations with Roman creditors, arguing persuasively that Egypt's long-term ability to repay its debts depended on preserving enough resources to keep the country productive and stable. She restructured internal taxation to ease the burden on farmers and merchants, while still ensuring adequate revenue for the crown. Most innovatively, she launched a series of bold new trading initiatives that capitalized on Egypt's unmatched strategic position at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe. The great harbors of Alexandria were expanded and modernized to accommodate larger merchant vessels arriving from across the Mediterranean. New warehouses with improved ventilation and security were constructed to reduce spoilage and theft. Cleopatra personally oversaw the negotiation of fresh trade agreements with kingdoms throughout the region, offering Egyptian grain, papyrus, linen, and luxury goods in exchange for timber from Lebanon, spices from Arabia, and metals from distant lands. The famous Egyptian grain exports were supplemented by manufactured products, exotic African ivory, and rare perfumes that commanded premium prices in every port. These economic reforms were not mere stopgap measures. They demonstrated Cleopatra's sophisticated understanding that political power and economic prosperity were inseparable. By strengthening Egypt's financial position, she reduced the kingdom's dangerous dependence on Roman goodwill and created the resources she would later need to rebuild the military and purchase diplomatic influence. Her early actions also revealed a deep political wisdom. She understood that survival required her to demonstrate competence quickly while simultaneously building the coalitions necessary for long-term success. She cultivated support among the powerful temple priests, who controlled vast estates and could legitimize her rule in the eyes of the Egyptian people. She strengthened ties with the military commanders who guarded the borders, ensuring their loyalty through promotions and improved supplies. She even reached out to the scholars and administrators who ran the day-to-day machinery of government, giving capable men and women from diverse backgrounds, Greek, Egyptian, and even some Roman residents of Alexandria, opportunities to rise if they proved useful to her vision. The young queen moved with astonishing confidence for someone who had only just turned 18. She reviewed reports late into the night by lamplight, walked the docks of Alexandria to inspect the new harbor works herself, and held private audiences with foreign merchants to seal trade deals. Every decision was calculated to project strength and competence while quietly preparing Egypt for the greater storms she knew were coming. She understood that her brother Ptolemy XIII, though still a child, was surrounded by ambitious advisors who already resented her growing authority. These men, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, began whispering that the young king should assert himself as the senior male ruler. Cleopatra watched these maneuvers carefully, but for now she focused on consolidating her own power base and restoring the kingdom's strength. The early reforms produced visible results almost immediately. Grain shipments increased, tax revenues stabilized, and the bustling activity in Alexandria's harbors signaled to the entire Mediterranean world that Egypt was once again a force to be reckoned with. Roman creditors, seeing the improved financial health of their client kingdom, became slightly more flexible in their demands. The Egyptian people, feeling the first benefits of competent rule, began to view their young queen with growing respect and even affection. For the first time in years, the kingdom seemed to be moving forward rather than sliding toward collapse. Yet Cleopatra never allowed herself to become complacent. She knew that these initial successes were only the foundation for far greater challenges that lay ahead. The co-rulership with her young brother remained a ticking political bomb. The relationship with Rome, while temporarily stabilized, was still one of dangerous dependence. And the unpredictable Nile continued to remind everyone that nature itself could undo even the most brilliant human plans in a single bad flood season. Still, in these first months of her reign, Cleopatra had shown the Mediterranean world something remarkable. A young woman who had inherited a weakened kingdom and, through intelligence, discipline, and decisive action, had already begun to turn its fortunes around. The golden halls of Alexandria once again rang with the sounds of purposeful activity. Scribes hurried through the palace corridors carrying updated tax rolls and trade manifests. Engineers directed teams of workers, strengthening the harbor walls and deepening the channels. Priests offered sacrifices of gratitude in the temples, sensing that a new and capable hand now guided the two lands. Cleopatra VII stood at the center of it all, 18 years old and already demonstrating the political genius that would one day make her the most famous ruler of her age. She had taken the throne under the most difficult circumstances imaginable, and in her very first year she had begun the work of transforming Egypt from a vulnerable client state into a Mediterranean power once more. The foundations she laid in 51 before the Common Era would prove essential in the trials that were soon to come. For now, however, the young pharaoh could look out from the palace terraces across the bustling harbor and know that she had taken the first decisive steps toward securing both her own power and the future of the kingdom she had sworn to protect. The journey that had begun in exile and uncertainty had reached a new and far more dangerous phase, but Cleopatra VII was ready. The foundations she laid in 51 before the Common Era would prove essential in the trials that were soon to come. For now, however, the young pharaoh could look out from the palace terraces across the bustling harbor and know that she had taken the first decisive steps towards securing both her own power and the future of the kingdom she had sworn to protect. The journey that had begun in exile and uncertainty had reached a new and far more dangerous phase. But Cleopatra VII was ready. Yet, even as the harbors of Alexandria hummed with renewed trade and the royal treasury began to show the first signs of recovery, a storm was gathering within the very walls of the palace itself. The co-rulership arrangement with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII who was now 13 years old, had always been a fragile compromise born of Ptolemaic tradition. On paper, they ruled together as king and queen, but in practice, the real authority had rested with the more experienced and capable Cleopatra. This imbalance did not go unnoticed by the ambitious circle of advisors who surrounded the young king. Chief among them were the eunuch Pothinus, a master of palace intrigue whose influence extended deep into the bureaucracy, and the general Achilles, commander of the royal Egyptian army and a man of ruthless ambition. Together, they formed a powerful faction that viewed the young queen as an obstacle to their own control over the kingdom. The tensions that had simmered beneath the surface for nearly 3 years finally began to boil over in the spring of 48 before the Common Era. The spark came from the distant but explosive events unfolding in the Roman world. News reached Alexandria that the long-simmering rivalry between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had erupted into full-scale civil war. The two most powerful men in the Roman Republic were now leading armies against each other in a conflict that would decide the future of the entire Mediterranean. Both sides were desperately seeking support from client kingdoms like Egypt, and the choice Cleopatra faced was fraught with peril. Aligned too closely with the losing side, and Egypt could face invasion and annexation. Choose correctly, however, and the kingdom might finally win the breathing room it needed to regain true independence. Cleopatra's analysis of the situation was characteristically sharp and forward-thinking. She had studied both Caesar and Pompey during her years in Rome as a child. Pompey represented the old Roman aristocracy, men who saw Eastern kingdoms primarily as sources of wealth to be exploited through tribute and control. Caesar, though equally ruthless, seemed to possess a more flexible mind and a greater willingness to build genuine alliances rather than mere vassal relationships. Her intelligence networks, carefully cultivated among merchants, diplomats, and spies throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, brought her regular reports suggesting that Caesar's forces, though outnumbered, were better organized, more motivated, and led with innovative tactics that Pompey's traditional legions struggled to match. She believed Caesar represented the future, while Pompey clung to a dying past. Her brother's advisors saw the matter differently. Pothinus and Achilles argued forcefully for immediate and unconditional support of Pompey. They reminded the young king that Pompey had personally helped restore their father to the throne years earlier and represented continuity with the existing arrangements that had kept the Ptolemaic dynasty in power. Backing Caesar, they warned, was a dangerous gamble that could provoke the wrath of the Roman Senate if Pompey prevailed. The disagreement was not merely tactical, it reflected deeper philosophical divides about Egypt's future. Cleopatra stood for a more assertive policy that emphasized Egyptian independence and cultural pride. Her brother's faction favored closer accommodation with Roman power, arguing that survival in the New World required accepting permanent subordination in exchange for protection. These policy clashes quickly escalated into open factional warfare within the palace. Pothinus and Achilles began whispering to the young king that his sister's independence was endangering the dynasty. They portrayed her reforms as reckless experiments that risked provoking Rome. They spread rumors among the nobility and the army that Cleopatra was placing her personal ambition above the safety of Egypt. The young Ptolemy XIII, still a boy easily swayed by flattery and fear, gradually fell under their complete influence. By the summer of 48 before the Common Era, the faction had grown bold enough to act. In a carefully orchestrated palace coup, Pothinus and Achilles mobilized the royal guard and seized control of the key points within the palace complex. Cleopatra was given no warning. One moment, she was reviewing trade manifests in her private chambers. The next, armed soldiers loyal to her brother's advisors were surrounding her apartments. She was given a stark choice: flee or face immediate arrest and probable execution on trumped-up charges of treason. With the calm dignity that had become her hallmark, Cleopatra chose survival. Accompanied by a small group of loyal servants and a handful of trusted officers who had remained faithful to her, she slipped out of Alexandria under cover of darkness and made her way into the Egyptian countryside. There, among the fertile fields along the Nile and the ancient temples of the interior, she began to rally what support she could while planning her next move. Exile, though painful, was not new to her. She had survived it once before as a child. This time, however, the stakes were infinitely higher. She was no longer a powerless princess. She was the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, and she refused to let a palace coup steal her birthright. For weeks, she moved secretly between loyal villages and sympathetic temples, gathering intelligence and building a network of supporters among the Egyptian priesthood and the rural population who had benefited from her early reforms. Yet she knew that words and local loyalty alone would not be enough to defeat the forces now controlling Alexandria. She needed something far more powerful. She needed Rome. The decision she reached during those tense weeks of exile was one of the most audacious gambles in ancient history. Rather than negotiating from weakness or attempting to raise a conventional army that would likely be crushed by her brother's forces, Cleopatra resolved to seek a personal alliance with the one man who could turn the tide: Julius Caesar himself. Caesar had recently arrived in Alexandria after his decisive victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus. He was now the undisputed master of the Roman world, but his position was still delicate. He needed money, grain, and secure supply lines to finish off the last remnants of Pompeian resistance. Egypt, with its legendary wealth and its strategic harbors, was exactly what he required. Cleopatra understood the risks perfectly. To reach Caesar, she would have to cross enemy-controlled territory, penetrate Roman military lines, and gain access to the most powerful and dangerous man in the Mediterranean while he was conducting active operations in a hostile city. Discovery would mean certain death. Failure would doom her dynasty forever. Yet, she also understood the opportunity. If she could forge a personal bond with Caesar, she could restore herself to the throne with Roman legions at her back and transform Egypt's relationship with Rome from one of humiliating dependence into something closer to genuine partnership. The gamble was enormous, but so was the potential reward. The plan she devised was as brilliant as it was daring. She would travel by sea under the cover of a routine merchant vessel, disguised among ordinary cargo. A small group of her most loyal supporters, including a trusted Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus, would accompany her. To avoid detection by her brother's patrols and Roman sentries, she would be concealed inside a large rolled carpet, a common luxury item traded throughout the Mediterranean. The carpet would be presented as a gift for Caesar himself, allowing it to be carried directly into the palace where he had established his headquarters. Every detail was calculated with the precision Cleopatra had learned from years of studying strategy and diplomacy. The timing, the route, the signals, the backup plans, nothing was left to chance. On a moonless night in the autumn of 48 before the Common Era, the small merchant ship slipped quietly out of a remote harbor along Egypt's Mediterranean coast. Cleopatra, wrapped carefully inside the thick, richly embroidered carpet, lay in darkness as the vessel made its way toward Alexandria. The voyage was fraught with peril. Roman naval patrols controlled the waters, and her brother's forces were actively searching for the exiled queen. Any suspicious vessel could be boarded and searched. The crew maintained the appearance of ordinary traders carrying textiles and luxury goods, but the tension on board was electric. Cleopatra remained perfectly still within her hiding place, her mind turning over every possible outcome, every risk, every opportunity. She knew that this single journey could decide the fate of Egypt for generations. As the ship approached the great harbor of Alexandria, the towering lighthouse cast its beacon across the water like a guiding star. Under cover of darkness, the vessel docked at a small wharf controlled by merchants still loyal to Cleopatra's cause. From there, Apollodorus and two trusted servants carried the heavy carpet through the streets and into the palace complex. Roman soldiers patrolled the perimeter, but the gift for their commander aroused no suspicion. The carpet was taken directly to Caesar's private quarters within the royal palace he had commandeered as his headquarters. The moment of revelation came in the quiet hours after midnight. Apollodorus unrolled the carpet with a flourish, and Cleopatra VII rose gracefully to her feet before the astonished gaze of Julius Caesar. At 21 years old, she was in the full bloom of her beauty and intelligence. She wore a simple but regal gown of Egyptian linen, her dark hair arranged in the traditional style of the pharaohs, and her eyes sparkled with the fierce determination of someone who had risked everything on this single meeting. Caesar, 52 years old, battle-hardened, and the master of Rome, was immediately captivated. Here was no frightened petitioner but a young queen who had smuggled herself through enemy lines with the audacity of a general and the poise of a born ruler. The conversation that followed would reshape the ancient world. Cleopatra spoke fluent Latin, addressing Caesar directly without interpreters. She laid out her case with the clarity and precision of a trained orator. She explained how her brother's advisors had usurped power in violation of Ptolemaic law and tradition. She presented evidence of their corruption and mismanagement. Most importantly, she offered Caesar exactly what he needed: the vast wealth and resources of Egypt to fuel his continuing campaigns. In return, she asked only for Roman military support to restore her to the throne and a new relationship between Egypt and Rome based on mutual respect rather than outright domination. Caesar was impressed. He recognized in Cleopatra the same bold strategic thinking and personal courage that had defined his own career. He saw a partner who could provide the grain, gold, and political stability his position required. She saw in him the military power necessary to crush her domestic enemies and secure her rule. Their alliance was forged not primarily through romance, though mutual attraction certainly played a part, but through cold, clear calculations of mutual self-interest. Caesar agreed to arbitrate the dispute between the royal siblings and to restore Cleopatra as the rightful pharaoh. In exchange, Egypt would support his cause with its treasury and its strategic position. The agreement was sealed, but implementing it would not be easy. Within hours of Cleopatra's arrival, Pothinus and Achilles learned of her presence and mobilized the 20,000-strong Egyptian royal army. They surrounded the palace complex and demanded that Caesar surrender the exiled queen. Caesar, with fewer than 4,000 legionnaires under his command, found himself trapped in Alexandria, vastly outnumbered and cut off from reinforcements. His ships were blockaded in the harbor, and his supply lines were severed. Any conventional military mind would have considered the situation hopeless. Yet Caesar was no conventional general, and Cleopatra was no ordinary queen. Together, they turned the crisis into an opportunity. Caesar declared himself the legal arbiter of the Egyptian succession and summoned both royal siblings to present their cases. Ptolemy XIII was brought into the palace under Roman guard, effectively becoming a hostage. In the dramatic proceedings that followed, Cleopatra spoke eloquently in Latin, presenting detailed plans for Egypt's prosperity and continued alliance with Rome. Her brother's representatives, speaking through interpreters and clearly uncomfortable with the Roman legal framework Caesar had imposed, could only repeat weak claims of male precedence. Caesar's verdict was never in doubt. Cleopatra would rule jointly with her brother as tradition required, but with Roman backing, she would hold the real power. The announcement triggered immediate violence. Pothinus and Achilles ordered their forces to storm the palace. What followed was one of the most extraordinary sieges in ancient history. Caesar's small band of legionnaires defended the royal complex against repeated assaults by vastly superior numbers. The fighting raged for weeks. Cleopatra played a crucial role throughout, using her intimate knowledge of the palace layout, her connections among the city's diverse population, and her ability to speak directly to Egyptian soldiers in their native tongue to gather intelligence and maintain pockets of support within the city. When the palace water supply was cut off, Caesar launched daring nighttime raids. When Egyptian ships threatened the harbor, he ordered part of the fleet burned, an act that accidentally spread to the Great Library and destroyed thousands of irreplaceable scrolls. The cultural tragedy was immense, but the tactical objective was achieved. Chaos in the city allowed Caesar to break out and establish a more defensible position along the waterfront. Roman reinforcements eventually arrived from Syria, tipping the balance. In the decisive battle that followed, Ptolemy XIII was killed, either in combat or by his own supporters hoping to escape Roman vengeance. Pothinus and Achilles were captured and executed. With her rivals eliminated and Caesar's legions controlling Alexandria, Cleopatra was finally secure upon the throne. The cost had been high. The city had suffered damage, trade had been disrupted, and Egypt's dependence on Rome had become more visible than ever. Yet Cleopatra had achieved what had seemed impossible. She had turned exile and near certain defeat into complete victory through sheer audacity and political genius. Caesar remained in Alexandria for several months after the siege, ostensibly to ensure stability but also enjoying the luxury, culture, and intellectual companionship Egypt could provide. Their personal relationship deepened during this time, blending genuine affection with continued strategic cooperation. Their partnership produced a son, Caesarion, born in 47 before the Common Era, whose existence created both new possibilities and new dangers for the future of both Egypt and Rome. When Caesar finally departed to continue his campaigns, he left behind a transformed Egypt and a queen who had proven herself one of the most remarkable figures of the age. The alliance forged in the shadows of a rolled carpet in 48 before the Common Era would echo through history. It had begun as a desperate gamble by a young exiled queen and a battle-hardened Roman dictator, but it had become the foundation for a relationship that would shake the Mediterranean world to its core. Cleopatra had risked everything on a single audacious meeting, and in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her throne but had placed Egypt at the very center of the Roman civil wars that were still unfolding. The woman who had once been forced to flee her own palace now stood beside the most powerful man in the known world, ready to face whatever challenges the coming years would bring. As the gentle rhythms of the Nile continued their eternal flow and the lighthouse of Alexandria kept its watch over the harbor, Cleopatra VII looked toward the future with the same unyielding confidence that had carried her through exile, coup, and siege. The Roman Civil War was far from over, and greater tests still lay ahead, but she had already demonstrated to the world that intelligence, courage, and strategic brilliance could overcome even the greatest odds. The foundations of her power were now reinforced by the might of Rome itself, and the young pharaoh who had risen from the carpet in Caesar's chambers was prepared to write the next chapter of her extraordinary story with the same daring and precision that had brought her this far. The months and years that followed would test every lesson she had learned, every alliance she had forged, and every skill she had mastered. Yet for now, in the afterglow of her triumphant return to power, Cleopatra could stand on the palace balcony once more, the Mediterranean breeze carrying the scents of salt and incense, and know that her bold gamble in 48 before the Common Era had not only saved her kingdom, but had elevated her to a position no Ptolemaic ruler before her had ever achieved. The alliance with Julius Caesar was more than a political arrangement. It was the beginning of a new era in which a queen of Egypt would stand as an equal partner at the center of Roman power. The story of that alliance, born in secrecy and sealed in the fires of siege, would captivate the world for more than 2,000 years, and its echoes would shape the course of Western civilization itself. Cleopatra VII had done what few rulers in history had ever accomplished. She had turned the chaos of civil war and the overwhelming might of Rome into instruments of her own ambition. She had transformed personal risk into dynastic security, and she had done it all with the quiet, relentless determination of a woman who understood that true power was never given. It was taken, negotiated, and defended every single day. The gentle waves lapping against the harbor walls seemed to whisper approval as the last pharaoh of Egypt prepared for whatever the future might bring, secure in the knowledge that she had already written one of the most remarkable chapters in the long and storied history of her ancient land. The alliance forged in the shadows of a rolled carpet in 48 before the Common Era would echo through history. It had begun as a desperate gamble by a young, exiled queen and a battle-hardened Roman dictator. But it had become the foundation for a relationship that would shake the Mediterranean world to its core. Cleopatra had risked everything on a single audacious meeting, and in doing so, she had not only reclaimed her throne but had placed Egypt at the very center of the Roman civil wars that were still unfolding. The woman who had once been forced to flee her own palace now stood beside the most powerful man in the known world, ready to face whatever challenges the coming years would bring. Yet the victory was far from secure. Within hours of Cleopatra's dramatic appearance in Caesar's private quarters, the palace complex erupted into controlled chaos. Pothinus and Achilles, the eunuch and the general who had orchestrated the coup against her, received word almost immediately. Their spies within the royal household had been watching every corridor and every shadowed doorway. When they learned that the exiled queen had not only returned but had done so under the direct protection of Julius Caesar himself, they moved with ruthless speed. 20,000 soldiers of the Egyptian royal army were mobilized at once. They poured into the streets of Alexandria from their barracks near the royal quarter, sealing off every approach to the palace. By dawn, the magnificent complex that had been Cleopatra's childhood home was completely surrounded. Torches flickered along the perimeter walls as Egyptian troops took up positions on rooftops, in gardens, and along the harbor front. The message was unmistakable. The Roman intruder and the traitorous queen would not leave alive. Caesar found himself in one of the most precarious situations of his entire career. His force inside the palace numbered fewer than 4,000 legionnaires, many of them veterans of the Gallic campaigns, but still vastly outnumbered by the Egyptian army that now controlled the city. His warships were trapped in the Great Harbor, blockaded by the Egyptian fleet. Supply lines back to Rome had been severed. Any conventional military assessment would have declared the position hopeless. Yet Caesar had not conquered half the known world by thinking conventionally. He recognized immediately that the crisis presented an extraordinary opportunity. If he could emerge victorious from this siege despite the overwhelming odds, Every client kingdom from Syria to Cyprus would understand that Roman friendship was worth preserving and Roman enmity was too dangerous to risk. His response was characteristically audacious. Rather than negotiating from weakness or attempting a desperate breakout, Caesar declared himself the legal arbiter of the Egyptian royal succession. As consul of Rome, he announced, he possessed the authority to resolve disputes within allied kingdoms. Both Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII would present their cases before him, and his decision would be binding on all parties. The proclamation transformed a pure military standoff into a formal legal proceeding. It gave Caesar the initiative while forcing his opponents to respond to his agenda rather than pursuing their own. Messengers were dispatched under flag of truce, and the young Ptolemy XIII was brought into the palace under Roman guard. Ostensibly, he came to participate in the arbitration. In reality, he had become Caesar's hostage. The proceedings that followed were a masterpiece of political theater. They took place in the grand audience hall of the palace, its marble floors still bearing the faint scent of incense from earlier ceremonies. Cleopatra stood before Caesar in a simple yet regal gown of Egyptian linen, dyed deep indigo, her dark hair arranged in the traditional style of the pharaohs. She spoke fluent Latin with the precision of a trained orator, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. She argued that her brother's advisors had violated ancient Ptolemaic law by usurping royal authority from the rightful senior heir. She presented carefully prepared evidence of their corruption, their mismanagement of the treasury, and their reckless foreign policy that had endangered the kingdom's independence. Most powerfully, she offered detailed plans for restoring Egypt's prosperity, reformed taxation, expanded trade routes, strengthened alliances, and a stable partnership with Rome that would benefit both sides. Every word was calculated to demonstrate competence, loyalty to Roman interests, and a vision for Egypt's future that aligned perfectly with Caesar's own strategic needs. Ptolemy XIII's representatives, speaking through nervous interpreters and clearly uncomfortable with the Roman legal framework Caesar had imposed, could only repeat their claims that the young king was the legitimate senior male ruler and that his sister's presence in Alexandria constituted open rebellion. Their arguments sounded weak and unconvincing in comparison to Cleopatra's sophisticated presentation. Caesar listened with the calm authority of a man who had already decided the outcome but who understood the value of maintaining the appearance of justice. When the hearings concluded, his verdict was delivered with the weight of Roman law behind it. Cleopatra was declared the rightful pharaoh of Egypt, but she would continue to rule jointly with her brother as tradition required. The decision appeared balanced, yet everyone in the hall understood its true meaning. With Roman backing and her superior political skills, Cleopatra would hold the real power. The announcement triggered immediate and violent resistance. Pothinus and Achilles recognized that accepting the verdict would mean the end of their influence. They ordered their forces to storm the palace complex and capture both Caesar and Cleopatra, hoping that eliminating the Roman general would restore their control over Egyptian policy. What followed was one of the most dramatic and prolonged sieges in ancient history. For weeks, the fighting raged across the palace grounds, the adjacent gardens, and the harbor districts. Caesar's small force of legionnaires defended the royal complex against repeated assaults by vastly superior Egyptian numbers. Roman discipline and engineering skill barely compensated for their numerical disadvantage. Barricades were thrown up overnight using marble statues, furniture, and anything else that could be moved. Legionaries fought in tight formations, their short swords and heavy shields proving devastating in the confined spaces of corridors and courtyards. Cleopatra played a crucial role throughout the siege. She refused to remain hidden in safety while the fate of her kingdom hung in the balance. Using her intimate knowledge of every secret passage, every hidden stairway, and every service tunnel within the sprawling palace, she coordinated resistance activities and gathered intelligence from loyal servants still moving through the city. Most importantly, her ability to speak fluent Egyptian proved invaluable. She moved among the Egyptian troops who had been pressed into service by Pothinus and Achilles, speaking directly to them in their native tongue. She reminded them of the reforms she had already begun, the improved trade that had brought prosperity to their families, and the ancient traditions of the pharaohs that her brother's faction was betraying. Her words sowed doubt and hesitation in the enemy ranks, undermining morale and occasionally prompting small groups of soldiers to defect or hold back during assaults. The situation inside the palace grew desperate. Egyptian forces managed to cut off the main water supply to the complex, forcing Caesar's men to rely on stored cisterns and risky nighttime expeditions to the harbor. Food stores dwindled, yet Caesar refused to surrender. Instead, he launched a series of brilliant nighttime raids. Small units of legionnaires slipped out through concealed gates, striking at Egyptian supply depots and command posts, creating confusion and eroding the confidence of troops who had expected an easy victory. Cleopatra personally helped plan several of these operations, drawing maps from memory and identifying the weakest points in the enemy lines. The turning point came when Caesar made the audacious decision to destroy part of Alexandria's famous harbor infrastructure to prevent Egyptian ships from reinforcing the siege. Roman engineers set fire to enemy vessels moored near the palace. The flames spread beyond their intended targets with terrifying speed. Wind carried the blaze into the warehouses along the waterfront, and then, catastrophically, into the great library of Alexandria itself. Thousands upon thousands of irreplaceable scrolls containing the accumulated knowledge of Greek philosophy, Egyptian mathematics, Babylonian astronomy, and medical treatises from across the known world were consumed in the inferno. The cultural tragedy was one of the greatest in ancient history, a loss that would never be fully recovered. Yet from a purely military standpoint, the fire achieved Caesar's immediate objective. The chaos it created throughout the city allowed his forces to break out of the immediate palace perimeter and establish a more defensible position along the harbor front. From there, his ships could receive limited supplies and reinforcements that managed to slip through the Egyptian blockade under cover of night. The siege dragged on for months. Both sides suffered heavy losses. The Egyptian army, though numerically superior, lacked the cohesion and tactical flexibility of the Roman legions. Caesar's men, though outnumbered, fought with the discipline of veterans who had campaigned across Gaul and Spain. Cleopatra moved constantly between strategy sessions with Caesar and quiet meetings with her remaining loyalists inside the city. She maintained morale among the small group of Egyptians who had remained faithful to her, promising them positions of honor once victory was secured. She also sent coded messages to sympathetic priests in the countryside, urging them to prepare for the arrival of Roman reinforcements and to spread word among the rural population that the rightful pharaoh would soon be restored. Finally, in the early months of 47 before the Common Era, the long-awaited reinforcements arrived. A relief force led by Mithridates of Pergamon, one of Caesar's most capable eastern allies, marched overland from Syria with additional Roman troops and local contingents. The arrival of these fresh soldiers shifted the balance decisively. Caesar launched a coordinated counteroffensive, combining his besieged legionnaires with the new arrivals in a series of brilliant maneuvers. The final battle took place on the outskirts of Alexandria. Roman discipline and tactical superiority proved overwhelming. Ptolemy XIII was killed during the fighting, either struck down in combat or assassinated by his own supporters, who hoped to escape Roman vengeance by eliminating the focal point of resistance. Pothinus and Achilles were captured, tried, and executed, their heads displayed publicly as a clear warning to any who would challenge Roman will or Cleopatra's authority. With her rivals eliminated and Caesar's legions controlling Alexandria, Cleopatra was at last secure upon the throne. The victory had come at enormous cost. The city's infrastructure had been damaged, trade had been disrupted for months, and the partial destruction of the Great Library represented an irreplaceable cultural loss. Most significantly, the crisis had made Egypt's dependence on Roman protection more obvious and complete than ever before. Cleopatra owed her throne directly to Caesar's intervention, creating obligations that would influence Egyptian policy for years to come. Yet she had achieved her immediate objective. She had regained power through a combination of personal courage, strategic brilliance, and an alliance that no other Eastern ruler had ever managed to forge so effectively. Caesar remained in Alexandria for several additional months after the conclusion of the fighting. Officially, he was ensuring political stability. In practice, he was enjoying the luxury, intellectual stimulation, and personal companionship that Egyptian civilization could provide. During this extended stay, the relationship between Caesar and Cleopatra deepened beyond their initial political alliance. They spent long evenings discussing philosophy, strategy, and the future of the Mediterranean world. Cleopatra introduced him to the greatest scholars still remaining in the library's surviving sections. She arranged tours of the ancient temples along the Nile and demonstrations of Egyptian agricultural techniques that had sustained the kingdom for 3,000 years. Caesar, in turn, shared with her the inner workings of Roman politics and military organization, knowledge that would prove invaluable in the years ahead. Their partnership during this period demonstrated how personal affection and cold political calculation could reinforce each other. Their union also produced a son, Ptolemy Caesar, known to history as Caesarion, born in 47 before the Common Era. The child represented a living bridge between Egyptian and Roman civilizations, a potential heir who could one day inherit claims in both worlds. His birth created new possibilities for Cleopatra's dynasty, while simultaneously introducing new dangers should Caesar's Roman enemies view the boy as a threat. When Caesar finally departed Alexandria to continue his campaigns against the remaining Republican forces, he left behind a transformed Egypt. The kingdom was more closely integrated with Roman power than ever before, yet it was also stronger internally than it had been at the start of Cleopatra's reign. The young queen, who had once smuggled herself into the city inside a rolled carpet, had emerged victorious from a siege that should have destroyed her. She had turned a desperate gamble into a complete triumph. The foundations of her power were now reinforced by the might of Rome itself, and the last pharaoh of Egypt stood ready to face whatever the future might bring. The war in Alexandria had tested every aspect of Cleopatra's remarkable education and natural abilities. She had navigated palace intrigue, commanded loyalty during a prolonged siege, and forged an alliance with the most powerful man in the Roman world. The months of fighting had damaged the city she loved, but they had also revealed the full extent of her political genius to the entire Mediterranean. As Caesar's ships disappeared beyond the horizon, Cleopatra stood once more on the palace balcony overlooking the great harbor. The Mediterranean breeze carried the familiar scents of salt, incense, and papyrus. The lighthouse still stood watch, its beacon glowing steadily against the evening sky. The kingdom she now ruled was battered but unbroken, and she was determined to rebuild it stronger than before. The victory of 47 before the Common Era marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Cleopatra VII had survived exile, coup, and siege. She had reclaimed her throne through audacity and intellect rather than mere force of arms. She had proven to the world that a young woman could wield power with the same mastery as the greatest generals and statesmen of her age. The road ahead would be filled with new challenges: the continuing Roman civil wars, the need to rebuild Egypt's economy, and the delicate balancing act of maintaining independence while honoring her alliance with Caesar. Yet, for now, in the quiet aftermath of victory, she could look out across the city she had fought so hard to save and know that every risk had been worth taking. The gentle rhythms of the Nile continued their eternal flow beyond the palace walls. Farmers repaired irrigation canals damaged during the fighting. Merchants began to return to the harbors, bringing news from distant ports. Priests offered sacrifices of thanksgiving in the temples, acknowledging the return of a pharaoh who spoke their language and respected their ancient traditions. Cleopatra moved among her people with quiet confidence, personally overseeing the first stages of reconstruction. She ordered repairs to the harbor facilities, the restoration of trade agreements, and the careful reorganization of the bureaucracy that had been disrupted by the war. Every decision reflected the same strategic brilliance that had carried her through the siege. The alliance with Caesar had restored her to power and demonstrated her capabilities to the entire Mediterranean world. Now she would need to prove that she could use that power to advance Egyptian interests, while maintaining the delicate balance of cooperation and independence that successful client rulers required. The years that followed Caesar's departure would test every skill Cleopatra had developed during her education and early political career. She would need to manage Egypt's internal affairs while navigating the treacherous waters of Roman politics, where Caesar's enemies were already plotting their revenge and his allies were positioning themselves for the power struggles that would determine the Republic's future. But the young woman who had smuggled herself into Alexandria to forge an alliance with the most powerful man in Rome had already demonstrated that she possessed the intelligence, courage, and strategic vision necessary to succeed where others had failed. Her next challenge would be to transform her personal victory into lasting benefits for the kingdom she had fought so hard to rule. The Egypt that Cleopatra now governed was simultaneously weakened by recent conflicts and strengthened by its new relationship with Roman power. The task before her was to rebuild Egyptian prosperity and independence, while avoiding the mistakes that had destroyed so many other Eastern kingdoms. Her success or failure would determine not only her own fate, but the survival of a civilization that had flourished along the Nile for over 3,000 years. As Caesar's ships disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying him back to the political struggles that awaited in Rome, Cleopatra stood on the palace balcony overlooking Alexandria's harbor, contemplating the enormous challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. She had won the first phase of her struggle for power, but the most difficult tests of her reign were yet to come. The woman who would become history's most famous queen was about to embark on the next stage of a journey that would take her from the palaces of Alexandria to the halls of Roman power. From the battlefields of the Eastern Mediterranean to the chambers where the fate of the ancient world would be decided. Yet for several months after the end of the siege, Julius Caesar remained in Alexandria. Officially, his presence was required to ensure political stability and to oversee the final settlement of the Egyptian succession. In truth, the Roman dictator had found in the Egyptian capital something far more compelling than mere duty. The city offered him luxury, intellectual stimulation, and the companionship of a woman who matched his own formidable mind. Cleopatra welcomed his extended stay with characteristic strategic grace. She understood that every additional day Caesar spent in Alexandria strengthened the personal and political bonds between them while giving her time to consolidate her restored authority. The months that followed were among the most extraordinary in Cleopatra's young life. Caesar, battle-scarred and 52 years old, discovered in the 21-year-old queen an intellectual equal. They spent long evenings in the palace gardens discussing philosophy, literature, and the art of governance. Cleopatra arranged private tours of the surviving sections of the Great Library, where scholars presented Caesar with the finest surviving works on mathematics, astronomy, and statecraft. She introduced him to Egyptian priests who explained the ancient rituals that had sustained the kingdom for 3 millennia. In return, Caesar shared with her the inner mechanics of Roman politics and military organization, knowledge she absorbed with the same hunger she had shown as a child in the palace schoolrooms. Their relationship deepened beyond politics into genuine affection. Caesar found in Cleopatra not only a beautiful and intelligent partner, but a woman who understood the burdens of supreme power. She could debate strategy with the precision of a general and yet speak with the warmth of someone who truly cared for the prosperity of her people. For Cleopatra, Caesar represented both a powerful protector and a man whose vision of a reorganized Mediterranean aligned with her own ambitions for Egypt. Their union was passionate yet always grounded in mutual respect and shared calculation. In the summer of 47 before the Common Era, their relationship produced a son. The child was named Ptolemy Caesar, but the people of Alexandria quickly began calling him Caesarion, Little Caesar. His birth was celebrated with great public rejoicing. Priests offered sacrifices in every temple along the Nile, and the royal scribes recorded the event as a divine blessing upon the dynasty. For Cleopatra, Caesarion represented far more than personal joy. He was a living bridge between the ancient civilization of Egypt and the rising power of Rome, a potential heir who could one day secure her family's future in both worlds. When Caesar finally departed Alexandria later that year to continue his campaigns against the remaining Republican forces, he left behind not only a son but a queen who had grown even stronger during his stay. Cleopatra watched his ship sail from the same palace balcony where she had once contemplated exile. She felt the weight of separation, yet she also recognized the strategic necessity. Egypt needed time to heal and rebuild, and Caesar needed to secure his dominance in Rome. She sent him off with lavish gifts, detailed intelligence reports on Eastern affairs, and a promise of continued support. In private, she vowed to use the coming months to transform the fragile victory of the siege into a permanent foundation of power. The years immediately following Caesar's departure marked a period of intense and purposeful reconstruction. Cleopatra threw herself into the work of governing with the same relentless energy she had shown during the siege. Her first priority was to rebuild the administrative systems that had been disrupted by the fighting. Many experienced officials had been killed or had fled during the coup and the subsequent war. Cleopatra conducted a careful review of every department, promoting capable men and women from diverse backgrounds while removing those whose loyalty remained questionable. Greek scholars were given expanded roles in diplomatic correspondence. Egyptian priests received greater authority in provincial administration, recognizing their influence with local populations. Even a small number of Roman residents of Alexandria were incorporated into advisory positions where their understanding of Roman customs could prove useful. This inclusive approach strengthened her regime by creating a broader base of support and providing her with multiple perspectives on complex problems. Economically, the kingdom still bore the scars of war and the heavy tribute payments demanded by Rome. Cleopatra responded with the same innovative thinking that had defined her early reforms. She expanded the harbor facilities at Alexandria, adding new docks capable of handling larger merchant vessels and improving storage warehouses to reduce spoilage. Trade agreements were renegotiated with kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, offering Egyptian grain, papyrus, linen, and luxury goods in exchange for timber, metals, and spices. Agricultural production was improved through better irrigation projects and the introduction of more resilient crop varieties. The annual flooding of the Nile was monitored with greater scientific precision, allowing administrators to prepare more effectively for years of poor inundation. These measures gradually restored Egypt's legendary prosperity and reduced the kingdom's dangerous dependence on Roman financial goodwill. At the same time, Cleopatra continued to cultivate her relationship with Caesar through regular correspondence. She provided him with valuable intelligence about political developments in the Eastern Mediterranean while seeking his guidance on matters that might affect Roman interests. These letters maintained the personal bond between them while ensuring that Egypt remained a useful and reliable ally. She also began quietly building relationships with other influential Romans who might play important roles in the future, hosting visiting senators and businessmen in Alexandria, and demonstrating both Egyptian hospitality and the kingdom's continued value as a partner. The peace Cleopatra worked so hard to build was shattered in March of 44 before the Common Era. Shocking news reached Alexandria that Julius Caesar had been assassinated in the Roman Senate by a conspiracy of senators led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. The man who had restored her to the throne, the father of her son, and one of the most powerful figures in the ancient world was dead. For Cleopatra, the blow was both personal and political. She had lost a partner, a protector, and a strategic anchor. Egypt's future relationship with Rome was now thrown into complete uncertainty. The conspirators, who styled themselves the liberators, might view Egypt as a hostile state that needed to be brought under tighter control. Caesar supporters might blame her for failing to warn them of the plot. Most dangerously, Caesar's death threatened to trigger another full-scale Roman civil war that could devastate the Eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra's response revealed both her emotional resilience and her extraordinary political maturity. Despite the personal grief and the sudden crisis, she acted immediately and decisively. She understood that survival required quick thinking rather than prolonged mourning. Her first priority was the security of her young son Caesarion, now 3 years old. She increased the guard around the royal nursery and established contingency plans for his protection and possible removal from Alexandria if the situation deteriorated. At the same time, she quietly ordered portions of the royal treasury to be moved to secure locations outside the city, creating financial reserves that could support resistance or exile if necessary. More importantly, she activated the extensive intelligence network she had built over the years. Egyptian merchants, diplomats, scholars, and agents throughout the Mediterranean were instructed to report on every development in Rome, military movements, political alignments, and the positions being taken by various Roman leaders regarding Egypt and other Eastern kingdoms. This network gave Cleopatra better information about Roman politics than many Romans possessed themselves. She learned that Caesar's assassination had not resolved the underlying conflicts within the Republic but had instead created new sources of instability. The liberators, led by Brutus and Cassius, were attempting to restore traditional Republican government, while Caesar's supporters, notably Mark Antony and the young Octavian, were positioning themselves as the defenders of his legacy. Another round of civil war appeared inevitable. Rather than choosing sides prematurely, Cleopatra positioned Egypt as a valuable ally for Mediterranean stability in general. She emphasized the kingdom's contributions to Roman commerce, its strategic location, and its cultural achievements. This approach allowed her to maintain relationships with multiple Roman factions while avoiding commitments that might prove dangerous if the balance of power shifted. She offered friendship and cooperation to any leader who respected Egyptian interests while reserving the right to withdraw support from those who threatened the kingdom's security. The assassination of Caesar created immediate practical challenges as well. Cleopatra increased security throughout Alexandria and the Nile Valley. she reviewed military preparedness and ensured that grain shipments continued to flow toward Roman armies, generating goodwill without overcommitting resources. She also began preparing concrete offers of assistance that would demonstrate Egypt's value as an ally while keeping the kingdom defensively strong. Through it all, she maintained the outward appearance of calm confidence that was essential for domestic stability. The Egyptian people, who had grown to respect their young queen, saw no signs of panic at court. Temples continued their rituals, markets remained open, and trade ships still sailed from the great harbor. In private, however, Cleopatra understood the gravity of the moment. The death of Caesar had removed her most powerful protector and left her son fatherless. Egypt's relationship with Rome was once again uncertain, and the coming struggle between Caesar's heirs and his assassins would determine the future of the entire Mediterranean. She knew that the next few years would require the same audacity and strategic brilliance that had carried her through exile and siege. She would need to navigate between competing Roman factions, protect her son, preserve Egypt's prosperity, and prepare for the possibility of renewed warfare. The young woman who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria inside a rolled carpet was now facing an even more complex diplomatic campaign. As the news from Rome continued to arrive with each passing ship, Cleopatra stood once more on the palace balcony overlooking the harbor. The Mediterranean breeze carried the familiar sense of salt and incense, but the world it touched had changed forever. Caesar was gone, yet the alliance he had forged with Egypt lived on through their son and through the strategic foundations she had carefully laid. The last pharaoh of Egypt had already survived greater dangers than most rulers ever faced. She would face this new crisis with the same intelligence, courage, and unyielding determination that had defined her reign from the very beginning. The gentle waves below seemed to whisper of the challenges ahead, but Cleopatra VII listened with the quiet confidence of a queen who had already turned the impossible into reality more than once. The story of her remarkable journey was far from over, and the next chapter would test every lesson she had learned in the years since she first rose to power. The months that followed Caesar's death revealed the true extent of the chaos his assassination had unleashed upon the Roman world. What the conspirators had intended as a restoration of republican virtue had instead created a power vacuum that ambitious men throughout the empire rushed to fill. For Cleopatra, monitoring these developments from Alexandria, the situation presented both unprecedented opportunities and existential dangers. Her intelligence networks reported that three distinct factions were emerging: the self-proclaimed liberators led by Brutus and Cassius, Mark Antony as the protector of Caesar's legacy, and the young Octavian claiming his inheritance as Caesar's adopted son. Cleopatra analyzed each group with the same sharp precision she had applied to every crisis before. She recognized that the eventual winner would likely emerge from a long and bloody process of elimination, and she positioned Egypt to remain valuable to whichever side ultimately prevailed. She avoided premature commitments while strengthening the kingdom's military and economic position, ensuring that any future alliance would be based on strength rather than desperation. The queen who had once risked everything to forge an alliance with Julius Caesar was about to embark on an even more delicate diplomatic campaign. The coming years would determine whether the Ptolemaic dynasty could survive the storms now engulfing the Roman world, and Cleopatra VII was ready to meet them with the same brilliance and courage that had already made her one of the most remarkable rulers of the ancient age. The months that followed Caesar's assassination in 44 before the Common Era unfolded like a slow-moving tempest across the Mediterranean. From the sunlit terraces of her palace in Alexandria, Cleopatra monitored every ripple with the steady gaze of a woman who had already survived exile, siege, and the death of her most powerful protector. Her vast intelligence network, merchants sailing under Egyptian flags, scholars traveling between libraries, diplomats stationed in every major port, and loyal agents embedded in Roman households, brought her detailed reports almost daily. What those reports revealed was a Roman Republic fracturing into three distinct and dangerous factions, each with its own vision for the future, and each carrying enormous implications for Egypt's survival. The first faction called themselves the Liberators, led by Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius. They controlled significant military forces in the eastern provinces and enjoyed the backing of traditional Roman aristocrats who genuinely believed they had saved the Republic from tyranny. Their philosophy was clear. They viewed eastern kingdoms like Egypt as sources of corruption that had encouraged Caesar's alleged descent into autocracy. If they prevailed, Cleopatra knew they would demand stricter Roman control over client states, heavier tribute, and the elimination of any personal alliances that blurred the line between Rome and the East. Supporting them would mean betraying the memory of Caesar and the father of her son. Refusing them outright could invite immediate military retaliation. The second faction coalesced around Mark Antony, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant and the man who had stood beside him in so many campaigns. Antony positioned himself as the guardian of Caesar's legacy. He understood the practical value of stable relationships with wealthy Eastern allies and had shown flexibility in his dealings with foreign rulers. Yet his reputation for impulsive decisions and personal indulgence made him a risky partner. Cleopatra studied him carefully through every report. She remembered the charismatic general who had visited Alexandria during the civil wars, and she sensed that he could become either her strongest protector or her most dangerous rival. The third and perhaps most unpredictable force was the young Octavian, Caesar's legally adopted son and heir. Only 19 years old at the time of the assassination, Octavian possessed the enormous advantage of Caesar's name, wealth, and political clientele. Despite his youth and limited military experience, he demonstrated a methodical mind and an ability to cultivate loyalty among Caesar's veteran soldiers. His faction emphasized a return to traditional Roman values, which could mean greater centralization and less tolerance for independent Eastern kingdoms. Cleopatra watched him with particular interest. She recognized in the young man a calculating intelligence that might one day rival Caesar's own. Rather than rushing to align with any single group, Cleopatra spent the winter of 43 before the Common Era, gathering more intelligence and weighing every possible outcome. She hosted Roman visitors in Alexandria with calculated warmth, listening more than she spoke, offering subtle hints of Egypt's value without making firm promises. She reviewed the kingdom's military readiness, strengthened harbor defenses, and quietly moved additional treasury reserves to secure locations along the Nile. At the same time, she continued the internal reforms that had begun in the early years of her reign, ensuring that Egypt remained prosperous and stable, no matter which Roman faction ultimately prevailed. The decisive moment arrived in the autumn of 43 before the Common Era, when news reached Alexandria that Antony and Octavian had overcome their mutual suspicions and formed a formal alliance with Marcus Lepidus, another of Caesar's former lieutenants. They called themselves the Second Triumvirate, a three-man commission granted extraordinary powers to restore order and avenge Caesar's death. Their first actions were ruthless. They published proscription lists naming hundreds of enemies, confiscated property to fund their armies, and ordered the execution of prominent figures such as the great orator Cicero. The formation of the triumvirate gave Caesar's supporters overwhelming advantages in resources and military strength. More importantly for Egyptian interests, it suggested that the eventual victors would be men who shared Caesar's pragmatic approach to governing eastern territories rather than the rigid republicanism of the liberators. Cleopatra made her choice with the same cold precision that had guided every major decision of her life. She would throw Egypt's full support behind the Second Triumvirate. The decision was not based on sentiment but on a careful calculation of long-term advantage. The liberators offered only subordination and cultural hostility. The triumvirate offered the possibility of genuine partnership. By acting early and decisively, she could position Egypt as an indispensable ally rather than a reluctant client. She dispatched embassies to both Antony and Octavian, expressing Egypt's loyalty to Caesar's memory and its desire to support his legitimate heirs. The messages were crafted with exquisite diplomacy. They appeared as acts of principled friendship rather than desperate bids for favor. More substantively, Cleopatra began mobilizing Egypt's legendary resources on a scale not seen since the early Ptolemaic wars. Vast shipments of grain, the lifeblood of any Roman army, were redirected from the royal granaries to supply the triumvirate's forces. Egyptian naval squadrons were quietly assembled and equipped for extended operations, their bronze-reinforced prows gleaming under the Mediterranean sun. Treasury officials gathered gold and silver from temples and storehouses to fund the purchase of weapons, mercenaries, and siege equipment. These contributions were presented as routine support for a legitimate Roman authority, but their strategic weight was unmistakable. Egypt was no longer a passive observer. It was becoming an active participant in the struggle that would decide the fate of the Roman world. The most audacious element of Cleopatra's commitment was her personal decision to command the Egyptian fleet. The agreement negotiated with the triumvirate specified that she would lead her own naval forces during the decisive campaign against Brutus and Cassius. At 26 years old, she would not remain safely in Alexandria while others fought on her behalf. She would sail with her ships, stand on the deck of her flagship, and direct operations alongside Roman commanders. The decision shocked many at court. Conservative nobles warned of the risks. Military officers questioned whether a queen should expose herself to the dangers of open sea warfare. Cleopatra listened to their concerns with patience, then explained her reasoning in private councils. Her presence would demonstrate Egypt's total commitment. It would earn the respect of Roman soldiers and commanders. Most importantly, it would ensure that Egyptian interests were protected at the highest level of decision-making. Throughout the spring and summer of 42 before the Common Era, preparations intensified. Egyptian shipwrights worked day and night in the royal dockyards, reinforcing hulls and mounting the latest siege engines adapted for naval combat. Crews trained relentlessly in formation maneuvers and boarding tactics. Cleopatra reviewed every detail personally: the placement of archers, the storage of provisions, the signals that would coordinate Egyptian vessels with Roman ones. She studied maps of the Greek coast, where the final confrontation was expected to occur, memorizing currents, wind patterns, and potential landing sites. Her flagship, a magnificent vessel nearly 200 feet long with purple sails and golden decorations, was fitted with every innovation her engineers could devise. When the fleet finally departed Alexandria's harbor in the late summer, more than 60 warships sailed in perfect formation, their oars striking the water in unified rhythm. Cleopatra stood on the raised deck, the Mediterranean wind catching her royal cloak, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The rendezvous with the main triumvirate fleet took place off the coast of Asia Minor. Hundreds of vessels from across the Roman world had gathered for the campaign. The sight of so many ships assembled in one place was a powerful demonstration of the resources the triumvirate could command. Cleopatra's arrival with her Egyptian squadron was greeted with formal ceremony that acknowledged her status as an allied sovereign. Roman officers boarded her flagship and were visibly impressed by the quality of Egyptian construction and the discipline of her crews. Strategic conferences followed, during which Cleopatra contributed tactical suggestions based on her deep knowledge of Mediterranean naval warfare. Her proposals were taken seriously. The commanders recognized both her intelligence and the value of her forces. The campaign culminated in the decisive Battle of Philippi in 42 before the Common Era. Although the final clashes were fought on land in the plains of northern Greece, the naval dimension proved crucial. Cleopatra's fleet helped secure supply lines, controlled key sea routes, and prevented Brutus and Cassius from receiving reinforcements or escaping by water. Egyptian ships provided covering fire for Roman boarding parties, deployed siege engines against enemy vessels, and pursued retreating squadrons with ruthless efficiency. Cleopatra commanded from the deck of her flagship, making real-time tactical decisions based on wind, visibility, and the shifting positions of allied and enemy forces. Her presence inspired her crews and earned the grudging respect of Roman officers who had once doubted the contribution of an Eastern queen. The victory was complete and overwhelming. Brutus and Cassius, realizing their cause was lost, took their own lives rather than face capture. Their surviving supporters scattered across the eastern Mediterranean, lacking the resources or organization to continue meaningful resistance. For the triumvirate, Philippi eliminated their most serious rivals and established their authority over the entire Roman world. For Cleopatra, it marked her emergence as one of the most important figures in Mediterranean politics. She had contributed meaningfully to the decisive battle, demonstrated the military capabilities of her kingdom, and proven her value as an active partner rather than a passive client. The post-battle negotiations reflected her strengthened position. Egypt received comprehensive guarantees of territorial integrity that went beyond previous arrangements. Trading rights were expanded, and most significantly, Caesarion's status as a legitimate member of Caesar's family was formally reaffirmed with provisions that could support future political claims. The agreements treated Egypt as an allied kingdom, contributing to joint operations for mutual benefit rather than a mere tributary state. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria not merely as a pharaoh who had secured favorable terms, but as a partner in an alliance that challenged traditional assumptions about Roman supremacy and Eastern subordination. As her fleet sailed back into the Great Harbor, the lighthouse beacon guiding them home like a welcoming star, Cleopatra stood once more on the deck of her flagship. The victory at Philippi had not only secured her immediate position, but had elevated Egypt to a level of influence no Ptolemaic ruler before her had achieved. She had observed the chaos of Roman politics, chosen the winning side with calculated precision, committed the kingdom's resources decisively, and personally led her fleet into the crucible of war. The rewards were substantial, yet she understood that the triumvirate's internal rivalries, particularly between Antony and Octavian, remained unresolved. The coming years would require the same vigilance and strategic brilliance that had carried her through Philippi. For now, however, the last pharaoh of Egypt could look out across the bustling harbor and feel the warm Mediterranean breeze on her face. The kingdom she ruled was stronger, more prosperous, and more respected than it had been at any point in her reign. The alliance she had forged through courage and intellect continued to bear fruit, and the young queen, who had once smuggled herself into Alexandria inside a rolled carpet, had now sailed at the head of a fleet that helped decide the fate of the Roman Republic itself. The story of her remarkable journey was still unfolding, but each chapter she wrote demonstrated the same truth. Intelligence, audacity, and unwavering determination could reshape the world. That truth would soon be tested once more in the winter of 41 before the Common Era, when a new chapter in Cleopatra's extraordinary story began to unfold. The victory at Philippi had elevated Egypt to unprecedented influence, yet the Second Triumvirate remained a fragile partnership between Mark Antony and Octavian. Antony, now assigned responsibility for the eastern provinces, faced the immense task of governing territories stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Euphrates River. He needed reliable allies, vast resources, and stable administration in the east. His gaze turned naturally toward the one ruler who had proven both her loyalty and her extraordinary capabilities during the campaign, Cleopatra VII. The invitation arrived in Alexandria with formal ceremony. Antony requested a personal meeting with the queen in the city of Tarsus, a wealthy commercial center in what is now southern Turkey. The location carried deep symbolic weight. It was here that Alexander the Great had once held court during his conquests, and Antony was deliberately positioning himself as the new Alexander, the heir to Hellenistic power in the East. The invitation was diplomatically worded, yet its meaning was unmistakable. Antony sought to formalize a closer alliance that would provide him with Egyptian wealth, naval strength, and administrative expertise, while offering Cleopatra greater security and influence within the Roman order. Cleopatra recognized the opportunity immediately. She had studied Antony during the campaigns leading to Philippi. She knew his military brilliance, his charismatic leadership, and his genuine appreciation for Eastern customs. She also understood his rivalry with Octavian and the pressures he faced in Rome. This meeting could transform their existing partnership into something far more profound, a true alliance that might secure Egyptian independence for generations while allowing her to shape the future of the Mediterranean world. She accepted the invitation with regal confidence, but she was determined that the encounter would take place on terms that proclaimed her as an equal sovereign, not a subordinate seeking favor. For weeks, the royal dockyards of Alexandria worked without pause. Egyptian shipwrights constructed what was essentially a floating palace, a magnificent barge unlike anything the Mediterranean had ever witnessed. Nearly 200 feet from stem to stern, it featured multiple banks of oars manned by the finest rowers in Egypt. The hull was adorned with gold leaf that caught the sunlight like living flame. Purple sails, the color of royalty, billowed above decks draped in rich fabrics and fragrant with incense. Musicians, dancers, and attendants were carefully selected to create a spectacle of power, beauty, and sophistication. Every detail was orchestrated to impress upon Antony and the Roman world that Cleopatra came not as a petitioner, but as a queen who could match any ruler in grandeur and vision. Cleopatra herself prepared with the same meticulous care she brought to every strategic decision. She chose garments that blended Egyptian tradition with Hellenistic elegance, a gown of the finest linen dyed in royal purple and gold, adorned with jewels that sparkled like stars. Her dark hair was arranged in the style of the pharaohs, crowned with the sacred Uraeus serpent that symbolized her divine authority. She reviewed every proposal for military cooperation, economic partnership, and administrative coordination, ensuring that any agreement would strengthen Egypt while preserving its autonomy. She understood that this meeting would be remembered for centuries, and she intended to make it a masterpiece of political theater. The voyage to Tarsus became a journey of deliberate majesty. As the royal barge glided out of Alexandria's great harbor, thousands of citizens lined the waterfront to witness the departure. The oars struck the water in perfect unison, accompanied by the music of flutes, harps, and drums that carried across the waves. Fragrant incense rose in scented clouds, and the golden prow cut through the Mediterranean like a living legend. Word of the approaching queen spread ahead of the fleet, drawing crowds to every coastal town. When the barge finally entered the harbor at Tarsus, the spectacle surpassed even the wildest expectations. People gathered along the riverbanks in awe as the magnificent vessel approached, its purple sails glowing in the afternoon light, its decks alive with music and the scent of exotic perfumes. It was as if the goddess Aphrodite herself had come to meet the new Dionysus, a comparison that Antony's supporters would later embrace with enthusiasm. Antony waited on the shore with his senior officers. He had planned a formal reception, but Cleopatra's arrival rendered all conventional ceremonies secondary. The Roman general, known for his bold and impulsive nature, was visibly struck by the display. He recognized instantly that this was no ordinary diplomatic visit. Cleopatra was announcing her equality in the most unmistakable terms, presenting herself as a partner worthy of respect rather than a client seeking protection. He boarded the royal barge with a small entourage, and the private conversations that followed over the next several days would reshape the balance of power in the ancient world. The meetings began with formal negotiations but quickly evolved into something deeper. Cleopatra and Antony discovered in each other two experienced rulers who understood the burdens and possibilities of supreme power. Both had risen through intelligence, courage, and political skill rather than mere inheritance. Both recognized that the future of the Mediterranean required a new kind of governance, one that blended Roman military strength with Hellenistic administrative genius and Egyptian wealth. They spoke for hours about strategy, philosophy, and the practical challenges of ruling diverse peoples. Antony shared his vision for the eastern provinces, a stable realm that could serve as the granary and cultural heart of a reorganized Roman world. Cleopatra offered concrete proposals for joint military operations, expanded trade networks, and administrative reforms that would benefit both Egypt and Rome. What began as political calculations soon deepened into genuine personal attraction. Antony was captivated by Cleopatra's intellect, her wit, and her unyielding confidence. She, in turn, found in him a man whose charisma and strategic mind matched her own ambitions. Their relationship was never merely romantic. It was a powerful fusion of personal passion and shared political vision. They saw in one another the possibility of creating something greater than either could achieve alone, a cooperative empire that honored both Eastern and Western traditions while securing the prosperity of their peoples. The alliance they forged in Tarsus was sealed not only in treaties but in the birth of 3 children over the following years. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. The boy's name evoked the sun and the memory of Alexander the Great, while the girl's name recalled the moon goddess and the Ptolemaic tradition of strong queens. 3 years later, in 36 BCE, their third child, Ptolemy Philadelphus, was born. These children became living symbols of the union between Egypt and Rome, bridges between two great civilizations. Cleopatra ensured they received an education that combined Egyptian royal traditions with Greek learning and Roman statecraft, preparing them for a future in which East and West might rule together rather than in opposition. Together, Cleopatra and Antony began to envision a new order for the Mediterranean. They imagined a realm in which Roman legions provided security, Hellenistic cities flourished as centers of learning and trade, and Egyptian agriculture and administration supplied the foundation of prosperity. Antony would govern the East with greater autonomy, while Cleopatra would maintain Egypt's distinctive identity as a partner rather than a subject. Their shared vision challenged the narrow Roman nationalism promoted by Octavian and offered instead a more inclusive model that could accommodate the diversity of the ancient world. It was a bold and revolutionary idea, one that would later provoke fierce opposition from those who feared the dilution of Roman supremacy. Yet for Cleopatra and Antony, it represented the logical evolution of the alliance Caesar had begun and the natural outcome of their own complementary strengths. As the meetings in Tarsus drew to a close, Antony and Cleopatra prepared to depart with agreements that bound their fates together. The queen returned to Alexandria with enhanced security guarantees, expanded trading rights, and a personal partnership that strengthened both her position and her kingdom. Antony turned his attention to the administration of the eastern provinces, now bolstered by Egyptian resources and counsel. The alliance they had formed would influence the course of Roman history for years to come, reshaping the balance of power and challenging traditional boundaries between East and West. Cleopatra stood once more on the deck of her royal barge as it sailed homeward, the purple sails catching the wind and carrying her back to the city she loved. The Mediterranean breeze was warm and scented with the promise of the future. She had transformed a diplomatic invitation into a partnership that elevated Egypt to the center of Mediterranean affairs. She had found in Mark Antony not only a powerful ally, but a man who shared her vision of a world in which intelligence and cooperation could triumph over division and conquest. The last pharaoh of Egypt had once again demonstrated that audacity, preparation, and unwavering determination could reshape the destiny of nations. The journey that had begun with a desperate gamble in a rolled carpet had now reached a new and even more magnificent phase, one that would test the strength of their alliance against the gathering storms still brewing in Rome. Yet for now, as the lighthouse of Alexandria appeared on the horizon to welcome her home, Cleopatra could look toward the future with the quiet confidence of a queen who had once again turned risk into triumph. The story of her remarkable life continued to unfold, each chapter more extraordinary than the last, written by a woman whose brilliance would echo through the ages. The months following Cleopatra's triumphant return to Alexandria from Tarsus marked a period of unprecedented prosperity and political influence for Egypt. The alliance forged with Mark Antony in the ancient city had transformed the kingdom from a client state living in the shadow of Rome into a true Mediterranean power, respected and courted by both Eastern and Western rulers. Cleopatra stood once more on the palace balcony overlooking the great harbor, watching the forest of masts that now filled the docks. Trade ships from every corner of the known world arrived daily, their holds heavy with timber from Lebanon, spices from Arabia, ivory from the African interior, and fine wines from the Greek islands. In return, Egyptian grain, papyrus, linen, perfumes, and luxury goods flowed outward, filling the royal treasury and bringing new wealth to farmers, merchants, and artisans alike. The prosperity was not accidental. Cleopatra poured the same relentless energy into governance that she had once devoted to survival. Harbor facilities were expanded with new docks capable of handling the largest merchant vessels of the age. Warehouses were rebuilt with improved ventilation and security systems that reduced spoilage and theft. Trade agreements were renegotiated and expanded, offering favorable terms to partners who recognized Egypt's central position between Africa, Asia, and Europe. The annual flooding of the Nile was monitored with greater scientific precision by astronomers and engineers, allowing administrators to prepare irrigation networks and grain storage more effectively than ever before. Crop yields rose steadily, and the kingdom's legendary agricultural wealth once again became the envy of the Mediterranean. Cultural and scientific cooperation with Rome flourished under the new alliance. Roman scholars and engineers arrived in Alexandria at Cleopatra's invitation, working alongside Egyptian priests and Greek philosophers in the surviving halls of the Great Library. Joint expeditions explored the upper reaches of the Nile and the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. New geographical knowledge emerged from these ventures, benefiting both Roman military planning and Egyptian commercial enterprises. Medical texts were exchanged and translated. Astronomical observations were shared between the two civilizations, improving calendars and navigation techniques. The palace became a vibrant center of intellectual exchange where Roman senators, Greek thinkers, and Egyptian scholars debated philosophy, mathematics, and statecraft late into the night. Antony, meanwhile, established his headquarters in Athens and later in other eastern cities, taking personal responsibility for governing Rome's vast eastern provinces. The division of power between the two triumvirs was clear. Antony managed the East, with its diverse kingdoms, Hellenistic cities, and ancient traditions, while Octavian focused on the West, consolidating control over Italy, Gaul, and the western provinces. This arrangement suited Cleopatra perfectly. It allowed her to work closely with a Roman leader who appreciated Eastern customs and understood the value of partnership rather than outright domination. Egyptian administrators and naval officers were dispatched to assist Antony in stabilizing the region. Joint military operations secured trade routes and protected against Parthian incursions. Egyptian grain shipments continued to supply Roman armies in the east, while Antony's legions provided the security that allowed Cleopatra to focus on internal development. The children born of the union between Cleopatra and Antony became living symbols of this new era of cooperation. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, born in 40 before the Common Era, were raised in the palace with an education that blended Egyptian royal traditions, Greek learning, and Roman statecraft. Their younger brother, Ptolemy Philadelphus, followed 3 years later. Cleopatra personally oversaw their schooling, ensuring they learned multiple languages, studied philosophy, and understood the complex politics of the Mediterranean world. They played in the palace gardens alongside children of prominent Egyptian and Greek families, creating early bonds that mirrored the larger alliance their parents were building. To the people of Alexandria, these children represented hope for a future in which East and West could rule together rather than in opposition. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity and cultural exchange, tensions between Antony and Octavian were steadily growing. The two men had never truly trusted each other, and their rivalry, once held in check by the need to defeat the Liberatores, now began to surface in increasingly public ways. Antony's flexible approach to governing the East, which incorporated local rulers and respected Hellenistic traditions, clashed with Octavian's vision of a more centralized, traditionally Roman empire. Disagreements over the distribution of territories, the settlement of veterans, and the allocation of resources created friction that could no longer be ignored. Octavian, ever the master of political calculation, began to weaponize these differences through a sophisticated propaganda campaign. From his base in Italy, he and his supporters portrayed Antony as a man corrupted by Eastern luxury and foreign influence. Cleopatra became the central figure in this narrative, depicted as the seductive Eastern queen who had lured a noble Roman general away from his duty to Rome. Pamphlets, speeches, and public rumors spread across Italy claimed that Antony had abandoned Roman values, dressed in Egyptian robes, and planned to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria. Cleopatra was painted as a foreign temptress whose ambition threatened the very soul of the Republic. The propaganda was relentless and effective. It resonated with Roman citizens weary of civil war and suspicious of anything that challenged traditional ideas of Roman supremacy. Cleopatra monitored these attacks with the same calm intelligence that had guided her through every previous crisis. She understood that propaganda was a weapon as powerful as any legion in the new Roman world. Rather than responding with open anger, she countered with quiet strength. She continued to host Roman visitors in Alexandria, demonstrating the prosperity and stability of her kingdom. She ensured that grain shipments to Italy remained steady, reminding Octavian's supporters that Egypt's cooperation was essential for their own security. She strengthened internal defenses and expanded intelligence networks to stay ahead of any potential threats. Most importantly, she deepened her partnership with Antony, coordinating policies that strengthened the eastern provinces while maintaining Egypt's distinctive identity. The years between 40 and 33 before the Common Era were therefore a delicate balancing act. On one side stood genuine prosperity and cultural flowering. Alexandria thrived as never before. Scholars from across the Mediterranean gathered in its libraries and lecture halls. Merchants filled its markets. The temples along the Nile received generous royal patronage, reinforcing the loyalty of the Egyptian priesthood and people. On the other side, the shadow of conflict with Octavian lengthened steadily. Each new rumor from Rome, each fresh pamphlet attacking the Egyptian queen, reminded Cleopatra that the peace she had built was fragile. The rivalry between the two triumvirs was no longer a private matter. It was becoming a struggle for the soul of the Roman world, and Egypt stood squarely at its center. Cleopatra refused to be defined by Octavian's propaganda. She continued to rule with the same strategic brilliance that had carried her from exile to power. She invested in military improvements that made Egypt a more valuable ally. She expanded diplomatic ties with kingdoms beyond direct Roman control, creating alternative sources of revenue and influence. She raised her children to embody the best of both civilizations, preparing them for whatever future the coming conflict might bring. Through it all, she maintained the outward appearance of calm confidence that inspired her subjects and reassured her allies. The gentle rhythms of the Nile continued their eternal flow beyond the palace walls. Farmers tended fields that yielded richer harvests than in generations past. Merchants negotiated deals that enriched the kingdom. Priests offered sacrifices of gratitude in temples that gleamed with new royal gifts. Yet Cleopatra knew that the golden age she had created could not last forever. The growing rift between Antony and Octavian was approaching a breaking point. The propaganda war in Rome was only the prelude to a larger confrontation that would decide the future of the Mediterranean. She had already survived greater dangers than most rulers ever faced, and she faced this new challenge with the same unyielding determination that had defined her entire reign. As the decade drew toward its close, the last pharaoh of Egypt stood ready. The prosperity she had built, the alliances she had forged, and the vision she shared with Antony would soon be tested against the gathering storm in the west. Octavian's campaign of words was sharpening into something far more dangerous, but Cleopatra VII had never been one to yield to fear or rumor. She had turned exile into triumph, siege into victory, and diplomatic invitation into lasting partnership. Whatever the coming years might bring, she would meet them with the same intelligence, courage, and strategic genius that had already made her one of history's most remarkable rulers. The story of her extraordinary life continued to unfold, each chapter more consequential than the last, written by a queen whose brilliance would echo through the ages. The story of her extraordinary life continued to unfold, each chapter more consequential than the last, written by a queen whose brilliance would echo through the ages. The decade that had brought Egypt such glittering prosperity now drew to a close amid gathering clouds that no amount of trade, wealth, or cultural splendor could disperse. By the summer of 32 before the Common Era, the fragile peace between Mark Antony and Octavian had finally shattered. The legal term of the Second Triumvirate expired, and neither man made any serious effort to renew it. Antony remained in the east, strengthening his alliances and preparing the provinces under his command for what he now saw as an inevitable confrontation. Octavian, from his power base in Italy, moved with the cold precision that had become his hallmark. He understood that the Roman people were weary of civil war and would never accept another conflict framed as brother against brother. His solution was both clever and ruthless. He declared war not on Antony, but on Cleopatra VII. The formal declaration was read before the Roman Senate and proclaimed across Italy. Octavian presented the conflict as a patriotic struggle against a foreign queen who had corrupted a noble Roman general and threatened the very heart of the Republic. Cleopatra, he claimed, planned to move the capital of the empire to Alexandria, to impose Egyptian customs on Rome, and to rule through Antony as her puppet. The propaganda machine that had been sharpening for years now reached its full fury. Pamphlets, speeches, and public inscriptions painted the Egyptian queen as a dangerous enchantress, a serpent of the Nile whose ambition would destroy everything Roman. Antony was portrayed as bewitched, weak, and no longer truly Roman. By framing the war as a defense of Rome against an Eastern invader, Octavian turned what was in reality a struggle for supreme power into a noble crusade that unified his supporters and neutralized potential opposition. Cleopatra received the news in Alexandria with the calm she had cultivated through every previous crisis. She had long anticipated this moment. For years she had watched Octavian's propaganda, strengthened Egypt's defenses, and deepened her partnership with Antony. Now the time for preparation was over. She summoned her council, reviewed the kingdom's resources, and issued orders with the same decisive clarity that had defined her reign. Egypt would not stand alone. She immediately began forging the broadest Eastern coalition the Mediterranean had seen since the days of Alexander. Messengers raced to Armenia, to the Arabian kingdoms, to the Greek cities that still cherished their ancient autonomy. Roman senators and officers disillusioned with Octavian's growing autocracy were quietly welcomed. Even some of the old Republican families who feared Octavian more than they distrusted the East sent private assurances of support. The coalition that took shape was vast and diverse. Egyptian legions and fleets, Armenian cavalry, Arabian archers, Greek marines, and defected Roman units fighting under the joint standard of Antony and Cleopatra. Cleopatra's most personal and audacious decision was to take direct command of the Egyptian fleet. She would not remain behind in the palace while others fought for her kingdom's future. She would sail at the head of her warships, standing on the deck of her flagship as she had done during the campaign that led to Philippi. The royal dockyards once again echoed with the sound of hammers and the shouts of shipwrights. More than 500 vessels were assembled and equipped for war. Egyptian engineers mounted the latest catapults and siege engines on reinforced decks. Archers trained under the harsh sun, and rowers practiced complex maneuvers until their movements were flawless. Cleopatra reviewed every detail herself: the placement of supply ships, the signals that would coordinate Egyptian and Roman vessels, the contingency plans for every possible wind and current. Her flagship, larger and more magnificent than ever, flew the royal purple sails and bore the sacred symbols of the pharaohs. When the fleet finally departed Alexandria's harbor in the spring of 31 before the Common Era, the entire city turned out to witness the departure. Thousands lined the waterfront as the Great Armada moved in perfect formation, oars striking the water in unified rhythm, the golden prow of the Queen's ship cutting through the waves like a promise of defiance. The campaign that followed carried the Allied forces westward toward the coast of Greece, where Octavian's fleet under the command of his brilliant admiral Marcus Agrippa was concentrating. Antony and Cleopatra established their main base at Actium, a strategic promontory on the western coast of Greece. For weeks, the two great fleets maneuvered for position, skirmishing in the waters of the Ambracian Gulf while supply lines stretched across the sea. Cleopatra's intelligence network continued to function even in the midst of war, bringing her daily reports on Agrippa's movements, the morale of Octavian's troops, and the political situation back in Italy. She coordinated closely with Antony, blending Egyptian naval expertise with Roman tactical doctrine. Their shared command was a living embodiment of the vision they had built together, East and West working as equals rather than master and servant. The decisive battle came on the 2nd of September in 31 before the Common Era. Dawn broke calm and clear over the waters off Actium. The opposing fleets faced each other across several miles of open sea, their formations stretching beyond the horizon. Octavian's ships, commanded with masterful precision by Agrippa, were lighter and more maneuverable, designed for ramming and boarding tactics that had served Rome well in earlier wars. Antony and Cleopatra's combined fleet was larger in number but heavier, carrying the pride of Egypt and the Eastern allies. Cleopatra's squadron formed a compact, disciplined unit on the left wing, positioned to exploit any opening while protecting the supply ships that carried the army's vital provisions. The battle raged for hours under the burning sun. Egyptian archers rained arrows on enemy decks. Catapults hurled burning projectiles that set sails ablaze. Roman boarding parties clashed with Egyptian marines in brutal hand-to-hand fighting across the decks of locked ships. Cleopatra commanded from the raised platform of her flagship, her voice steady as she issued orders that were relayed by signal flags and swift messengers. She saw the shifting winds, the gaps in Agrippa's line, and the moments when coordinated strikes could break the enemy formation. For a time it seemed the Allied fleet might prevail through sheer weight of numbers and the determination of Cleopatra's crews, who fought with the knowledge that their queen stood among them. Yet the tide turned with devastating swiftness. Agrippa's lighter vessels executed a brilliant flanking maneuver, exploiting a momentary gap created when part of the Egyptian line surged forward too aggressively. Fires broke out on several of Antony's larger ships. Confusion spread through the Allied ranks as commanders struggled to maintain formation under the relentless pressure. Cleopatra recognized the danger instantly. With the calm precision that had defined every crisis of her life, she signaled her squadron to break through the enemy line and head for open water. Her ships cut through the chaos like a blade, their oars flashing in perfect unison, carrying the queen and the core of the Egyptian fleet toward safety. Antony, seeing his queen's ships withdraw, believed the battle lost and followed with his remaining vessels rather than risk annihilation. The retreat from Actium was not the panicked flight that later Roman propaganda would claim. It was a calculated decision made under fire by a commander who understood that preserving the fleet and the army was more important than dying gloriously in a lost cause. Yet the psychological impact was enormous. The Allied forces that remained on shore, seeing their leaders depart, lost heart. Many surrendered or scattered. Octavian's victory was complete and decisive. The Battle of Actium had lasted less than a single day, yet it shattered the grand alliance that Cleopatra and Antony had spent years building. The dream of a cooperative Mediterranean empire that honored both East and West lay broken on the waters of the Ambracian Gulf. Cleopatra's fleet, though battered, reached the safety of the open sea and eventually made its way back toward Egypt. She stood on the deck of her flagship as the Greek coast faded behind her, the Mediterranean wind carrying the salt spray across her face. The defeat was bitter, yet she refused to yield to despair. She still commanded the wealth of Egypt, the loyalty of her people, and the resources of a kingdom that had survived far worse. Antony's forces would regroup, new alliances could be formed, and the war was not yet over. As the lighthouse of Alexandria appeared once more on the horizon to welcome her home, Cleopatra VII lifted her head with the same unyielding determination that had carried her from exile to the height of power. The final chapter of her reign had begun, and she would write it with the same courage, intelligence, and strategic brilliance that had defined every page of her remarkable life. The gentle waves that had once carried her to triumph now carried the weight of a kingdom fighting for its survival. Yet the last pharaoh of Egypt faced the future without fear. She had turned greater dangers into victory before, and she would meet this new challenge with the same quiet resolve that had made her one of history's most extraordinary rulers. The story that had begun in the golden palaces of Alexandria more than 30 years earlier was approaching its final, most dramatic act, but Cleopatra VII remained ready to face whatever the gods and the Romans might bring. The defeat at Actium had shattered the grand alliance that Cleopatra and Antony had spent years building, yet the war itself was not yet over. As the battered Egyptian fleet cut through the waves toward home, Cleopatra stood on the deck of her flagship, the purple sails still flying defiantly above her. The Mediterranean wind carried the salt spray across her face, but her gaze remained steady and unyielding. She had lost a battle, not a kingdom. Egypt's wealth, her people's loyalty, and the strategic depth of the Nile Valley still remained. Antony's remaining forces would regroup, new alliances could be sought, and the fight for the future of the East would continue on Egyptian soil. The royal fleet reached Alexandria in the late autumn of 31 before the Common Era. The lighthouse beacon welcomed them home as it had welcomed every returning ship for centuries. Crowds lined the harbor, silent and watchful. They had heard the news of Actium, yet they saw their queen step ashore with the same regal poise that had defined her reign. Cleopatra immediately set to work. She ordered the repair and reinforcement of the city's defenses, moved additional treasury reserves to secure locations along the Nile, and sent messengers to every corner of the kingdom, calling for loyalty and calm. She reviewed grain stores, strengthened the army with fresh recruits from the countryside, and prepared contingency plans for every possible outcome. Even in defeat, she refused to appear broken. The people of Egypt, who had come to love their intelligent and capable queen, responded with quiet determination. Temples offered sacrifices for her safety, and farmers pledged their harvests to support the coming struggle. Antony joined her in Alexandria a short time later. The once charismatic general who had dreamed of a new Mediterranean order now carried the weight of Actium on his shoulders. Yet the bond between him and Cleopatra remained unbroken. They spent long hours in the palace planning their next moves, reviewing intelligence reports, and reassuring each other that the cause was not lost. Octavian, they knew, would come. He could not allow them to remain free. The final confrontation would take place on Egyptian soil, and they would meet it together. In the summer of 30 before the Common Era, Octavian's forces landed in Egypt. The Roman army advanced with ruthless efficiency, moving up the Nile Delta toward Alexandria. Antony rode out to meet them with the troops that remained loyal, fighting with the courage of a man who had nothing left to lose. For a brief moment it seemed he might turn the tide. His cavalry charged with fury, and for hours the outcome hung in the balance. But numbers and Octavian's careful planning proved decisive. Antony's forces were overwhelmed. When he learned that Cleopatra's own troops had begun to desert and that the city itself was on the verge of surrender, he believed the queen he loved had already fallen. In despair, he withdrew to the palace and, according to the ancient accounts, fell on his own sword. He was carried, mortally wounded, to Cleopatra's chambers. There, in the final moments of his life, the two lovers said their goodbyes. Antony died in her arms, the man who had once ruled half the Roman world now finding his end in the embrace of the last pharaoh of Egypt. Cleopatra faced the final hours of her life with the same composure and strategic brilliance that had defined every chapter of her reign. She knew Octavian intended to parade her through the streets of Rome as a captive, a living trophy to prove his victory over the East. She would never allow that humiliation. She had already sent Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, away with trusted guardians toward the south, hoping he might escape to safety in Ethiopia or beyond. She ordered the royal treasury sealed and prepared messages urging her people to remember her not as a defeated queen but as one who had fought to the end for Egyptian independence. In the quiet of the royal apartments, surrounded by her most loyal servants, Cleopatra made her final choice. According to the ancient tradition that has echoed through the centuries, she summoned a small basket containing a fig. Hidden within, it was an asp, the sacred cobra of Egypt, whose venom was said to bring a swift and painless death. She held the serpent to her breast and allowed it to deliver its fatal bite. At 39 years old, Cleopatra VII Philopator, the last pharaoh of Egypt, passed from this world on her own terms, dressed in the full regalia of the ancient kings, her dignity and courage intact until the very end. Octavian entered Alexandria as conqueror. He found the queen he had feared and vilified already beyond his reach. Caesarion, the boy who might have carried both Caesar's name and Cleopatra's blood into the future, was captured and executed on Octavian's orders. With the death of the last Ptolemaic heir, the 300-year dynasty that had begun with Alexander the Great's generals came to its final, tragic close. Egypt, the oldest and proudest kingdom in the ancient world, was reduced to a Roman province. The golden age of the pharaohs, which had endured for more than 3,000 years, was over. Yet Cleopatra's story did not end with her death. In the years and centuries that followed, her name refused to fade. Roman historians, writing under Octavian's successors, tried to portray her as a dangerous seductress who had nearly destroyed Rome. But the truth they could not erase was far more powerful. Cleopatra VII had been the last ruler of an independent Egypt. She had spoken 9 languages, mastered the arts of governance, and negotiated with the most powerful men of her age on equal terms. She had prolonged her kingdom's freedom longer than any other Ptolemaic ruler could have hoped, playing the great powers against one another with the same skill her ancestors had once employed. She had rebuilt Alexandria's economy, expanded its trade, protected its culture, and stood as a bridge between the ancient world of the Nile and the rising world of Rome. Her intelligence, her courage, and her unmatched political genius turned her from a young exiled princess into one of history's most enduring symbols of leadership. She had shown that true power lies not in birth or beauty alone, but in the relentless pursuit of knowledge, the willingness to take extraordinary risks, and the wisdom to adapt when the world itself is changing around you. For more than 2,000 years, poets, playwrights, and storytellers have returned to her tale, each generation finding in Cleopatra something new and timeless. A woman who refused to accept the limits others tried to place upon her, who fought for her people and her vision until the very last breath. As the gentle music carries you deeper into this peaceful night, let the final images of this remarkable journey drift softly through your mind. Picture the golden palaces of Alexandria bathed in the warm light of the setting sun, the lighthouse still guiding ships safely home across the centuries, and the eternal flow of the Nile carrying the memory of the last pharaoh onward. Feel the warm Mediterranean breeze on the palace terraces, hear the quiet rustle of papyrus scrolls being unrolled one final time, and sense the steady determination that lived in the heart of a queen who changed the ancient world forever. Breathe slowly and deeply. Let the extraordinary story of Cleopatra VII settle gently over you like a soft blanket woven from the threads of history itself, and drift peacefully toward restful sleep, knowing that her legacy of courage and brilliance continues to inspire anyone who dares to dream of a greater destiny. Sweet dreams.
Tonight's story comes to an end here, but the past never truly goes silent. It lingers like a candle's last glow, whispering its warnings, its wonders, and its unanswered questions into the present. If this journey moved you, leave a like, subscribe to Ancient Luminaries, and tell me in the comments